Muy buenos días a todos, muchas gracias. Muy contenta de estar aquí, poder compartir con ustedes algunas de las ideas que los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales han expresado a través de un proceso muy importante de debate. Permítanme iniciar con 3 ideas de contexto que me parecen importantes y que todos deberíamos de tener en nuestra bagaje de información. El primero tiene que ver con que los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales representan un enorme sector de gran diversidad. Y esto presenta un enorme reto para la discusión de los temas que son prioritarios para este sector. Para poner un ejemplo, yo considero que uno de los grandes ausentes hasta el momento en la discusión han sido los sectores de comunidades costeras y de pesca artesanal de pequeña escala, y debería la discusión incorporar pronto a esos foros mundiales de pescadores y de comunidades costeras para tener una discusión más amplia de estos temas en sectores que pueden ser afectados. El segundo elemento tiene que ver con que ya tenemos muchos compromisos adquiridos por los países en función de la necesidad de un respeto a los derechos humanos de los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales. En este sentido, el artículo 8J mismo del Convenio de Diversidad Biológica, la UNDRIP, las directrices voluntarias de pesca de pequeña escala, el convenio 169, son fundamentales de recordar. Y podría ser muy interesante incorporarlos quizá en los párrafos iniciales del marco global, como el párrafo 12, por ejemplo, asumiendo también que vamos a promover la implementación de todos estos acuerdos que previamente han sido ya considerados por los países. Y finalmente, las conclusiones del informe del Observatorio Local de Biodiversidad, que dejó elementos de gran importancia sobre las metas de Aichi y su cumplimiento. En ese documento, temas como la seguridad de derechos de la tierra y el mar y la tenencia consuetudinaria, el tema de seguridad alimentaria, de cultura y respeto al conocimiento tradicional, fueron enfatizados con gran fuerza y mencionada la importancia de que existieran elementos relevantes que midieran en los futuros marcos globales de biodiversidad cómo íbamos o no cumpliendo estos elementos que habían hecho, digamos, mella en el cumplimiento de las metas de Aichi. Necesitamos entonces corregir estos desbalances entre las necesidades humanas y la conservación de la naturaleza, lo que los pueblos indígenas han llamado relaciones bioculturales. Y en ese sentido, algunos de los elementos importantes son la inclusión y transversalización del concepto del enfoque de derechos humanos, tanto en el glosario como avanzar en los indicadores que van a medir cómo este enfoque se mide. Y clarificar muy bien que si se va a utilizar un enfoque solamente de derechos, este enfoque debe de ser sustentado en aquellos acuerdos y principios de los derechos humanos. La teoría del cambio de este marco global es todavía débil en los temas y consideraciones sociales y culturales. Y en los temas de participación, donde se agradece, en este caso el objetivo 20 y 21, necesitan ser un poco más precisos. ¿Qué quiere decir esto? Precisos en que, por ejemplo, debemos asegurar los derechos de tenencia, que son un requisito fundamental para alcanzar la conservación basada en áreas, que debemos de tener el conocimiento tradicional como un elemento fundamental en la toma de decisiones en los territorios de vida de pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales. Es fundamental en este marco global que se haga una diferencia clara y conceptual de lo que son los sujetos de derecho y los actores, de forma que tengamos una claridad de cuál es la importancia en la toma de decisiones de cada uno de estos. Y ver una enorme oportunidad de que la distribución justa y equitativa de los beneficios derivados del uso de la biodiversidad no sea solo en función de los recursos genéticos, sino también incluya los recursos biológicos y el enfoque también de ecosistemas. Los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales han expresado a lo largo de estos tiempos de discusión del marco que están en la mejor disposición de un diálogo abierto en donde se conviertan ellos también en compañeros de la implementación de este plan global. Pero para ello tenemos algunas cosas que resolver. Por ejemplo, en el tema de uso consuetudinario han mencionado la importancia de fortalecerlo, mencionando claramente las leyes consuetudinarias. Es decir, que las prácticas de uso tradicional no se criminalicen o sean consideradas como no sostenibles desde fuera de sus territorios de vida. Y en este sentido, los objetivos 2, 3, 4, 5, 9 y 10 deberían de incorporar esta visión si realmente queremos incorporar a estos sectores y reconocer su aporte en la conservación de la biodiversidad. Mantener y respetar el consentimiento libre, previo e informado es fundamental en todo el texto y se ha solicitado por parte de los pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales que este concepto sea planteado de la forma como ha sido aprobado en la Convención de Diversidad Biológica y no se le llame de forma diferente. Finalmente, en este tema, la necesidad de incorporar y reconocer la inclusión de género, el valor, el trabajo y el conocimiento tradicional de mujeres indígenas, mujeres pescadores y rurales a lo largo de todo el documento, y que se refleje esto en las metas e indicadores del marco. El tercer elemento que quería mencionarles es en referencia a otras formas de conservación efectivas y eficientes, basadas en áreas, y también sobre la coalición para la naturaleza y la gente, liderada en este caso por mi país, Costa Rica, y también por Francia. Creo que uno de los principales elementos que los pueblos indígenas y comunidades indígenas, comunidades locales han mencionado, es la necesidad de reconocer que bajo sus territorios existen iniciativas de conservación de mares y tierras que deben ser claramente reconocidos. Que la conservación sin la participación y la consulta efectiva y plena afecta la vida de estas comunidades locales y de los pueblos indígenas. Y que el acceso a la información, el acceso a la objeción cultural y sobre todo su consentimiento informado previo son elementos fundamentales de los cuales no podemos hacer omisión. El tema de los derechos sobre la tierra, los ríos, los mares y el acceso a los recursos para su aprovechamiento sostenible en los territorios de estos pueblos deben ser reconocidos. La gobernanza equitativa de los territorios de vida no puede ser cambiada, no puede ser sustituida. Y en este sentido, la necesidad de que la gobernanza equitativa sea considerada en el objetivo 1, 3, el 20 y el 21 se hace fundamental. Y también se menciona que las iniciativas de restauración que pueblos indígenas y comunidades locales han apoyado y deben ser reconocidas desde todas las perspectivas de esta convención. Finalmente, para el futuro me gustaría compartir con ustedes lo que el representante de la OIT mencionó en la semana pasada en una discusión precisamente que los pueblos indígenas y las comunidades locales lideraron. Él decía que no solamente tenemos que pensar en el hoy, sino también en el mañana. Y para esto es fundamental pensar en las transformaciones de las instituciones y de los gobiernos, cómo van a trabajar este enfoque que se está liderando por el esfuerzo global de conservación de la biodiversidad y la necesidad de un trabajo integral, interinstitucional en el abordaje para poder poner en su derecho el enfoque de derechos humanos a lo largo de la conservación de la biodiversidad. Muchas gracias y cualquier pregunta con mucho gusto.
Sorry, yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. It's nighttime for me here. I'm based here in Asia, in Thailand. So my name is Mrinalini, and I am the convener of the CBD Women's Caucus that has been engaging in the post-2020 on gender issues since quite some time now. So we've been working very closely with our allies here, and I'm very happy to be here to be able to share our first reflections very briefly in a very short time of how we see it and what are some of the elements that we would like to kind of see more reference in the open-ended working group 3 that's going to take place next week. So with that, let me start. And for the interpretation, please let me know if I'm talking too fast. I usually have a tendency to do so. So I will be slow, but I'm happy to also answer any questions after the presentation. Okay, so Gadi, just let me know if it's showing, and I'm going to kind of
yes,
put my.
We can see it. We can see it.
I'm going to put myself down because it always interrupts it. Okay, So is it full screen or okay?
Yes, it's okay.
All right, so yeah, so once again, Mrinalini Rai, and I'm here representing the CBD Women's Caucus. So my presentation is a gender responsive post-2020, and we're reflecting on the draft 1 that was recently published in July. So I just wanted to I thought building up, I won't repeat a lot of the things that colleagues have already said, Vivienne, and we'll also have other colleagues presenting, but just on the gender part of it, I just wanted to briefly reflect back on the CBD convention text. In the CBD's preamble, it recognizes the close and traditional dependence of many indigenous and local communities and biodiversity. And it also very specifically recognizes the vital role that women play and affirms the need for the full participation of women at all levels of policymaking and implementation for biological diversity conservation. And along with that, it also states that aware that conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity is a crucial importance of meeting the food health of the growing world's population. So why I wanted to draw on this was looking at how during the COP14, when the principles or how the post-2020 should be reflected on, there was a lot of discussions, a lot of key elements that were supposed to be reflected. And of course, one of them was on gender responsiveness of the post-2020. So when we reviewed the document, specifically, now there are 21 targets. This is the only target that actually mentions women and girls. And under this target, I want to also get everybody's attention that at the open-ended working group, though we are looking at the goals and targets, another discussion or the documents that have been presented are the headline indicators and the monitoring framework. And the monitoring framework is one of the key documents according to which the implementation of the post-2020 would be validated or assessed. So for us, we've been very closely looking at what's coming in the monitoring framework and the indicators. So if you look at the indicator, I just want to ensure that the headline indicator for this is again limited to decision making, and on land tenure is on the traditional territories of indigenous peoples and local communities. So what we're really also seeing is that there is also a lack of having a gender responsive or inclusive indicators reflected adequately in the whole of the GBF. So that has been one of the work that we've been really following closely, is to ensure how we can request or encourage parties to have more gender responsive indicators reflective, and more on what has already been selected using the baseline of some of the SDGs indicators that are already being in use. So again, I mean, why are we really talking about gender, and why are we really focusing on gender, and why are we saying that it's really very important, besides having it mainstream, is that we need to follow the facts. There are a lot of data, a lot of research being done that is showcasing us that there is gender-based violence and their environment is linked. This is from also a very recent publication taken out by IUCN, and which talks about the gender-based violence is also employed as a weapon against environmental defenders, diminishing or silencing their work. And so gender-based violence is not only a human rights violation, but also a barrier to conservation and sustainable development. As also Vivienne pointed out, that women are also part of the coastal and marine ecosystems. Women make up 47% of the global fisheries workforce. They contribute to 11% of the global catch from small-scale fisheries and 12% of these fisheries value. And women also feed the world. So women in rural economies take up to close to 50% of the world's agricultural forces, but yet only represent the 20% of the world's landholders. I'm just taking out very brief snapshots because these are some of the elements or the components which are in the post-2020, including target 1, 2, 3, and a lot of them. But you really don't see a lot of how these goals and targets really being inclusive of gender and women's rights to these agendas. So as we go ahead, and we will have more on the human rights-based approach, I just wanted to also present this. One key objective of ours is we would like to propose a new target on gender. And this is not something new. We have been doing this since 2018. We've been talking about the indicators. And we had also proposed a target on gender in the open-ended working group too, in Rome last year, which also had some party support. So looking at that, there is a lack of gender responsiveness. We, again, considering that there are parties here in the webinar and looking at our challenge of meeting in person, I'm using this opportunity to present our main proposal that we would be bringing to the open-ended working group is on a proposed new target on gender. Now we are working on the drafting, but it has got to do more on to implement measures and mechanisms to ensure, monitor, and report on women and girls' ownership, equal access to biological resources, and associated benefits, and the equitable engagement at all levels of decision-making.
Sorry, Tina.
Did you let me know? I'm on the last slide, I think. Yeah, great. So I'll finish after this. So just an overall recommendation that we wanted to present with everybody here, piled up with building up what will come ahead, is that to achieve the 13 guiding principles that was presented at the CBD COP14 for the post-2020 GBF. We would like the components and elements addressed in consideration of the CEDAW and the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, using more gender-specific indicators, and adopt a new target on gender equality, and aligning the post-2020 gender plan of action, which is also taking place alongside the post-2020. And of course, a human rights-based approach should be taken to ensure everybody's well-being and that no one is left behind for a just, safe, and equitable future. So I'll leave it until that, and I'll be happy to take any other questions that may come. Thanks, Kadir. Sorry for rushing.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's afternoon this side. My name is Msweli from South Africa, but I'm currently based in Kenya, working for the African Wildlife Foundation. I am speaking on behalf of the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance, which is an alliance of more than 80 CSOs that came together starting last year in February to strengthen the African CSOs' voice in the post-2020. Forgive me as I will be putting my mic off for most of the intervention due to reception challenges. I would love to start by emphasizing that at ACBA, which is short for African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance, we are grounded by our vision of conservation in Africa, where biodiversity thrives and underpins equitable, socially and economically resilient livelihoods based on the rights of people to sustainably use natural resources. Just like many partners, we do welcome the first draft of the post-2020, but have made a few observations. At large, on the post-2020 at large, this week, an article that we published with fellow conservationists in Africa was published in the Science which basically emphasizes our position that biodiversity frameworks have historically put more focus on biodiversity-rich and intact areas, therefore increasing the responsibility for protection in the Global South. As the Alliance, we believe that to address biodiversity loss, measures need to put in place across all landscapes where, irrespective of the state, contributes. Degraded lands get restored, areas occupied by people are sustainable, and areas under protection get effectively managed as well. We believe that land, fresh waters, and oceans outside protected areas need to get as much attention as investment as those in protected areas, and IPLCs need to be capacitated and supported to sustainably manage the land that they occupy. We are of the view that sustainable management of all landscapes and seascapes is actually more important than expanding the core protected area estates. My colleagues will be posting in the link to the science paper. Now, specifically on the first draft of the post-2020, we have some concerns related to target 3 on expanding area under protection. As Africans, we have learned during the Aichi period and way before that period that such targets are often implemented defying the human rights-based approach. We expect that more effort in the implementation of this target will be towards OECMs and providing necessary sustainable support and resources for IPLCs to manage their areas instead of removing them from their lands to make way for militarized protected areas that do not serve local interest. Our support for OECMs is conditional on having strong local governance system, local leadership, effective participation, respect for local rights, culture, and knowledge. To that effect, target 20 and 21 is of utmost importance to us. We do understand that this is a global target, but in order for it to be achieved, parties need to contribute significantly. Hence, we worry about whether this target is attainable, looking at the reality that we only have 9 years left before 2030, and that some countries in Africa have still not reached the Aichi target. And some of those who reach the Aichi target, this actually includes protected areas created way before the convention itself had begun. So we worry that it may not be realistic enough to achieve this target in the space of 9 years. We do believe that targets must be ambitious, but realistic and attainable, and they must not just be charismatic only. On the last point, while ACBA supports the call for high ambitious targets across goals, we recognize that ambitious targets require equally ambitious financial resources. One of the reasons we couldn't implement the Aichi targets was, of course, the gap in financial resources. The current target 19 is putting that ambition at around $200 billion per year. We are aware that the funding gap is way above that. We are also aware that this amount of $200 billion will be complemented by resources redirected from harmful subsidies as stipulated in Target 18. But of course, Target 18 on its own will take years to implement. Africa requires a significant share of global financial resources, given that it has a large share of remaining intact biodiversity and yet a small share of global funds for conservation and sustainable use. The resources available for the region must be as ambitious as the target and expectations. But it's not just about resources being available. They need to be available where they are needed the most and when they are needed the most and at a sustainable level. Now, in closing, the African CSOs Biodiversity Alliance feels that digital sequence information is very important and can involve utilization and commercialization of genetic information. Therefore, we feel it has a role to play in resource mobilization, and it must be reflected in the post-2020. Thank you so much.
And good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to all. So this is Souparna. I'm based in New Delhi, India, and I'm representing Global Forest Coalition. Just a sec. Yeah, just to rearrange my, okay. So we will give a brief reflection on the first draft of the GBF here. While Global Forest Coalition is a global coalition of 118 indigenous peoples organizations, women's groups, and NGOs from 70 different countries. And we advocate for the conservation and restoration of forest ecosystems, defending and promoting respect for the rights, territories, traditional knowledge, and sustainable livelihoods of the IPLCs and women that coexist with them. For us, the GBF should recognize and defend the conservation efforts of right holders to hold biodiversity loss. And here we are very clear that we support what Vivienne presented and also support the requirement of a self-standing target on gender justice, as pointed out by Tina from CBD Women's Caucus. As you know, that forests and other ecosystems are perfectly capable of managing themselves, and they have done it for millions of years. And so what, other than the need for human management, what they need is effective and equitable governance to halt destruction. IPLCs account for 37% of all remaining natural lands across the earth, and not even 1/3 of the global land has some kind of legal protection or support for the IPLCs. And therefore, the current GBF must recognize the role and rights of the IPLCs and women and their governance system. Human rights-based approaches should be integrated throughout the GBF, and the term management that has been frequently used should be replaced by equitable right-based gender justice governance. If we come to the issue of target 3, and then say that the review of the implementation of the IT targets have already shown that PAs are not very effective as an instrument to address the root causes of biodiversity loss. Their additionality is questionable. They cannot protect areas against climate change. They're associated with serious human rights violations. And in SDG 15.2, the governments have already committed to protect 100% of forests from deforestation and degradation by 2020. Of course, that has gone by. And so here, a mere target of 30% would be a massive regression. And we also feel that the IP territories and community conserved areas are more equitable, gender just, sustainable, effective, and resilient than protected areas. But they are still largely being ignored by the policy makers on the ground. So we need, in terms of the GBF target, to include 100% rights-based, gender-just, equitably governed conserved areas with appropriate recognition of the indispensable role of the indigenous territories and community conserved areas to play and to halt biodiversity loss. This is what we have also observed in a report that we published in 2018 of the Community Conservation and Resilience Initiative from 22 countries across the world. And some of the findings do match with what we are pointing out now. Next, the GBF should clearly acknowledge the impacts of industrial meat and feedstock production, other industrial monocultures, and extractive industries, which contribute to biodiversity loss and destruction. The target should include a call for dietary change and reject destructive solutions to climate change like bioenergy and large-scale tree plantations. These bioenergy and large-scale tree plantations, we point out, are however false solutions and should not be part of any solution within the draft GBF framework. You can see this even IPCC's special report on land, which clearly recommended dietary shift and eat less meat, calling for change to human diet. Now, coming to the main root causes of biodiversity loss, investment and in incentives in biodiversity destruction and activities rather than conservation. Now, deforestation and biodiversity loss is primarily caused by destructive activities. And we know that by now there have been reports and studies to point out that between 4 to 6 million USD and 260 billion USD of perverse incentive finances incentives. So the draft GBF should include a mandatory requirement to align all human activities and financial flows with the CBD and its objectives and commitments. A really strong and progressive target on redirecting perverse incentives should be included in the draft. Now, effective implementation of these targets is only possible if the dependency of public institutions on private sector finance and thus private sector economic interest is addressed. This requires essentially challenging and reversing the corporate capture of national and international policy making, self-regulation of producers and consumers, as currently proposed in the draft, specifically pointing out to targets 15 and 16 is unacceptable. The increased reliance on private sector financing and market-based approaches is seriously undermining public governance. And so when we also, if we can add a brief on target 8, where we are seeing that the GBF, by proposing a CDR of a scale of 10 GT CO2 equivalent per year, which by the IPCC report is a very higher side of carbon removal, and that is only possible by untested solutions, false solutions, and dangerous destructions like the carbon capture and storage, or bioenergy carbon capture and storage, and possibly other geoengineering solutions. And these are false solutions which the draft GBF should totally avoid. Thank you. I am willing to respond to anything that you have, any questions for me in the chat.
I was just saying that I think as we go through this presentation, one of the things that I've noted in this seminar so far is that a large amount of the substantive meaning of the human rights-based approach has already been brought up by a number of speakers. So I think you'll see me repeat in this presentation some of the key points that have been brought up by colleagues already. So I'd like to endorse and support the comments that have been made already. The first thing I wanted to just quickly say is to put this presentation into context. This is not from me or from Forest People's Programme alone. It comes from a group called the Human Rights in Biodiversity Working Group. And this is a small working group, which is open if others would like to join, that's been working together since early 2020, when we held a meeting in Chiang Mai on human rights in the post-2020 biodiversity framework. Some of the members of that group are listed on screen now, and you've heard from a number of them already in this seminar today. Two of the key outputs that have previously come from this working group, one is an information document that went into SBI. The link is on the screen here. And then the second is an analysis of human rights in the zero draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the link is also on the screen. Obviously, this presentation will be made available to everyone, so you'll be able to follow those directly. For the second one, it's available in French and Spanish, as well as English. So I wanted to take a brief step back to the main question of why a human rights-based approach. And this is a very easy question to answer. The UN system as a whole has endorsed and put forward the importance of a human rights-based approach in all of their work for a long time. But we've seen, particularly over the last 2 to 5 years, a flurry of resolutions from the Human Rights Council and also a range of reports from UN human rights experts that have highlighted specifically the need to integrate human rights in environmental action and in the implementation of environmental treaties. We've got a briefing that will be coming out tomorrow and will be translated in French and Spanish as well. And it gives a number of those references to where human rights experts are really underpinning the link and the fact that you can't address one of these crises without addressing human rights at the same time. So because of this, we welcome that this draft 1 does refer to a rights-based approach. And we are firmly of the view that it is not if or why a human rights-based approach, but how, and what does it mean in practice? So these are the questions that we're grappling with and providing advice on. We also wanted to make the point that we recommend the use of the full phrase human rights-based approach for a number of reasons, but one is that this is already really well established within the UN system, and it's already been accepted by the parties to the CBD. In 2016, so 7 years ago, a declaration of the party of the CBD committed specifically to incorporate an approach like this, an economic, social and cultural approach with full respect for nature and human rights. So in this post-2020 framework, we're looking for nothing more than some of the commitments we've already seen on paper. So then we turn to the second question then, which is what is a human rights-based approach? And there are a couple of points we wanted to make here. One is that at its simplest, a human rights-based approach is an approach to anything which doesn't violate human rights in its implementation. And more than that, that in its design and implementation, it actively seeks ways to support or promote human rights. So we need to think about how that applies to the conservation, sustainable use and benefit sharing that we see in the Convention on Biological Diversity. The second point we wanted to make is there's significant work that's already been done on developing these norms, and a human rights-based approach to climate change action. There's already been a range of work done by the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, also by the UN Environment Programme, also contained within the UN Common Approach on a human rights-based approach. And these expertise, this work already done is ready to be tapped. It's ready to be applied into the implementation of the CBD. The third point that we wanted to make is that it is very likely that sector-specific guidance on how to do a human rights-based approach in actual implementation is very likely to be needed, potentially as post-COP work, potentially as work after the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So we would like to see in the decision a decision to adopt the GBF that includes a request for further guidance on a human rights-based approach to be developed with relevant international organisations, but also with relevant national and local organisations. So what do we need to see now in the draft 1 in order to better implement or integrate a human rights-based approach? I don't want to take too much time because I know we've got some really good presentations still to come. So I won't read through all of these, but the key points in terms of general comments are that we would like to see the term human rights. It doesn't appear in the post-2020 GBF as is, only the term rights-based approach. So we would like to see human rights and direct reference to international human rights instruments. We'd also like to see a definition of a human rights-based approach. We'd like to see involvement of key agencies like the OHCHR and UNEP in the development of such a definition. And that we'd also like to see this request for further guidance to be developed in consultation with appropriate organisations. But in order to do this, the GBF itself needs to, in that second part of what a human rights-based approach is, it needs to seek ways to promote and secure human rights in its text as well. So there are a few points that that our briefing elaborates in a lot more detail, but I'd just like to touch on a few key ones now. The first has been mentioned already by a number of speakers, and that is the importance of securing the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities to their lands, territories, and resources. We welcome that this is now in Target 21, but it has to be in Targets 1, 2, and 3 as the area-based targets of the GBF. Any reference to area-based targets or the expansion or change of the way areas are managed needs to reference the rights of Indigenous peoples and communities to their lands. The second point we wanted to really highlight was equitable governance. We know from IPBES work and also from the local biodiversity work that equitable governance is essential in the management of area-based conservation and sustainable use measures. So we would like to see equitable governance in Target 3 in particular, but also Target 1 and for Target 20 and 21. We would also like to see broadening of the scope of fair and equitable benefit sharing. So it is not just genetic resources, but also refers to the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from biological resources and ecosystem services. We would also, and this echoes something that Souparna has already spoken to, we'd like to see increased accountability of business and the financial sector. We see an increased role for them. We don't yet see an increased accountability for their actions. We'd like to see further guidance developed with reference to the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. We'd also like to see equitable access to financial resources. So wherever resource mobilization is mentioned, equitable access for Indigenous peoples, local communities, and those most directly impacted by the biodiversity crisis. We'd also like to see resources used that apply human rights conditions to area-based finance. What this means is we apply human rights conditions to the expansion of any protected or conserved areas or any other change in area-based measures. Gadira, I'm assuming you'll interrupt me if I go on too long.
Well, yeah, we're a little bit out of the time.
Okay.
But you can finish. Yeah.
Great. I won't do a lot then, but what I'd really like to highlight is it is essential to have some reference to human environmental rights defenders. We haven't seen that yet. There's a lot of state support for it, and we'd like to see it in this. We also need to see impact assessment done in a much more holistic fashion. So social and human rights impacts, as well as biodiversity. And then the very last, I'll pick up 3 points from this. First, to echo what Tina has already said about gender equity and equality, but then also to look at intergenerational equity. And we've got some really strong recommendations from the Global Youth Caucus on how to address intergenerational equality in Target 21, also Goal B, also Target 11. And then finally, one of the really important things about a human rights-based approach is it requires strong compliance, monitoring, and accountability. So what we would like to see in the GBF is a much improved monitoring system that includes things like multi-source reporting and also review of implementation by sector experts, not just by government representatives. Thank you, Gadira, and I will stop there because I know that was near over the end of my time. Thanks.
My name is Ching. I'm from Malaysia and I work with the Third World Network. Thank you for the opportunity to share our reflections. And I'm going to focus on resource mobilization. Obviously, it's a very important topic. And I'll focus largely on targets 18 and 19, but I wanted us to bear in mind that there is also a strategy for resource mobilization to be adopted at COP15 and ongoing discussions under the SBI. So we need to situate the GBF in this as well. The first point I wanted to make was that we need to understand resource mobilization for biodiversity within the larger context of the very deeply extractive and inequitable global economy, which is driven by wealthy and powerful elites and corporations. And this is both historical and present. While more resources are undoubtedly required to halt biodiversity loss, we must see this as not just a problem of funding, but one of structural and political and systemic political economy root causes. And by this, including governments actively subsidizing extractive and biodiversity harming industries, encouraging extractivism through trade and investment deals, austerity and debt loads on developing countries depleting public finances and impeding government action, tax evasion by wealthy elites and corporations draining public coffers, and of course, not to mention the trillions of dollars that go into harmful extractive investments by private corporations, right? Now, not only does this lead to biodiversity loss, but it continues to pose threats to IPLCs, women, and the most vulnerable. And there is an interaction with persistent inequalities, whether it's of race, gender, caste, and wealth, which not only disproportionately affect these communities more, but also then end up legitimizing and fueling further extractivism. Now, nothing in the current goals and targets of the first draft addresses these structural issues. This is a fundamental flaw. For more information, I'll point you to our report that we published earlier this year called Beyond the Gap. It's available on our website. Turning now to draft 1. Target 18 addresses harmful incentives or subsidies. And of course, these should be rightly eliminated in a just and equitable way. Now, the OECD conservatively estimated in 2020 that the flow of harmful subsidies was about $500 billion per year. This is already 5 to 6 times greater than the monetary resources flowing towards biodiversity. And more recently, of course, we've had the Dasgupta review and other studies that estimate the total global cost of subsidies that damage biodiversity at 4 to 6 trillion US dollars per year. Now, this is clearly a key issue that needs to be addressed. The failure to meet Aichi Target 3 means we cannot continue just doing the same ineffective thing. But we see that mistakes are being repeated even in this current pandemic situation. A just recently released report from Bailout Watch, Public Citizen, and Friends of the Earth, which tracks US taxpayer funds flowing to fossil fuel companies, showed that a total of $110 billion were given to 66 companies, including 10.4 to 15.2 billion US dollars in direct disbursements to coal, oil, and gas companies. Now, this is not the right way to go, we know it. And what's actually missing from Target 18 is the justice component. There's actually an urgent need to regulate finance and penalize the industries that damage biodiversity and the rights of IPLCs. This is currently absent from the target, because we know we cannot simply rely on voluntary mechanisms to just trust businesses to do the right thing. We know these have failed to drive action at the pace or scale necessary. And in addition to regulation, the target should also compel governments to disclose subsidies, as identifying harmful subsidies is the first step to eliminating them. Target 18 also talks about incentives that are, sorry, I can't change the slide. Yeah, there we go. Target 18 also talks about incentives that are neutral or positive for biodiversity. And if we look at the one-pager drafted by the co-chairs, there's some examples provided, but there's also a note indicating that there is interest in payment for ecosystem services, or PES. But research, however, shows that market-based approaches like PES are not a major new source of funding for biodiversity. Some schemes don't even include biodiversity at all. And for the very few biodiversity payment for ecosystem services schemes, they actually show very narrow scope and uncertain results. And what the experience has shown that the programs that have been most successful have actually integrated local traditions and institutions with strong representation of local values and knowledge and equitable benefit sharing. Now, this points to a strong role for governments in prioritizing equity objectives, putting in place locally appropriate and robust safeguards against market risks, and governance arrangements that empower IPLCs, integrate local knowledge, and recognize IPLC rights. Now, these aspects are missing again from the current target. While Target 19 to increase financial resources is welcome, the quantums are still too low, especially if we consider the trillions that are flowing to biodiversity harmful incentives. 200 billion, 10 billion earmarked for developing countries. These are extremely low figures. Now, of course, we know Article 20 of the CBD refers to parties' common but differentiated responsibilities, the obligation of developed countries to provide new and additional financial resources to enable developing countries to effectively implement the CBD. This obligation has not been met. Now, then when we consider the ecological and climate debts that rich industrialized countries have accrued over the last 500 years through their overuse of the world's resources, and to make matters worse, the extractive economic development has social and environmental costs that we know fall disproportionately upon IPLCs, smallholder producers, women, and people of color. Yet, importantly, the evidence consistently shows that it is IPLCs who are effectively conserving and sustainably using biodiversity. Now, this is a glaring gap in the current Target 19 it is completely silent on the need for resources to be channeled to support ongoing stewardship by IPLCs and to protect their rights so that they can continue autonomously safeguarding biodiversity. And I encourage you to read this briefing put out by the Forest Peoples Programs that illustrates and explains this very clearly. Finally, my last point, referring to target 19 again, is with regard to the phrase leveraging private finance. Now, this is based on a claim that the public sector cannot provide the finances needed. Therefore, there's a need for private sector financing. This is really about blended finance, the use of public, philanthropic, or supranational funding to leverage or unlock or catalyze private investments. But the track record of private for-profit biodiversity finance shows that flows are actually small and pose risks to livelihoods and rights, with examples of dispossessions of IPLC. There's a risk of private gains and social losses, as blended finance merely guarantees the incomes of investors and investment bankers, rather than peoples and nature. So instead of leveraging private finance, Target 19 should rather point to other ways of mobilizing public funds and establishing policies that disincentivize environmental degradation in the first place. Now, if we address structural barriers that countries face, and by this I mean debt, austerity, and tax avoidance, there will be adequate public funds. Let's just throw out some figures. For example, Fortune 500 companies have an estimated 2.3 trillion in tax havens, and this costs governments 500 to 600 billions a year. The loss to lower income economies is about 200 billion a year, and this totally eclipses development assistance. Developing countries' debt is around $11 trillion, with debt service payments at 3.4 trillion annually. Just imagine how multilateral tax reform and sovereign debt restructuring and forgiveness in line with CBD objectives would allow governments to prioritize investments in biodiversity, as well as pandemic recovery that is just and sustainable. So I'll stop here. These are some of our proposals and ideas that perhaps go beyond the traditional remits or parameters that when we talk about resource mobilization, but these are really important principles and issues, systemic issues that we feel do have to be addressed if we are really to see resources flow to biodiversity and to the peoples who conserve and sustainably use biodiversity. Thank you very much.
Let me get my screen up here and I'll go right into it. You should see the screen now. So 5 minutes to do DSI is a bit of a challenge, but I'll do my best to hit some of the high points. The subtitle of the, well, let me say this. In the course of doing many presentations on DSI and participating in many conversations about it over the last few years, you frequently get the reaction that it sounds like a really fascinating issue, but it's something that's very hard to wrap your head around. I've recently come upon this notion of datafication, and it may be helpful for people in sort of putting together their thoughts about what's going on with DSI. And that's that.
Sorry to interrupt you, Edward. Could you slow down?
Slow down, sure. And that's really that we all know now that all of our clicks and all of our likes and all of our activity online and interactions are being collected and going into databases. And in a sense, the same process is happening with biodiversity through the mass sequencing of all types of organisms and subsequent use of big data and artificial intelligence techniques to analyze that information. So if that may be a helpful concept to you, that biodiversity in a sense is being datafied in the same way that many other things that we're more familiar with in our lives we know have been. The problem with DSI is really quite straightforward and significant. You know, in the first human genome that was sequenced, took 13 years and what would now be over US $5 billion and 20 laboratories. Today, you can have your genome sequenced in a few days for $300 US. Initially, in order to sequence an organism, even a very small organisms like a bacteria, in the 1990s, shortly after the CBD was negotiated and as it was coming into force, it would require rooms full of very expensive equipment. Today, many of those functions can be completed by a $900 USB stick. In the beginning, we talked about sequencing single genomes in the sense of one individual from a species being somehow representative of all the diversity of that species. Not anymore. And now, particularly in the context of the pandemic, we're talking seriously about sequencing a very large proportion of the individuals from any given species. And we've also, in the sense of the depth, we've evolved not only in the depth of sequencing that's conducted on individual species, but also obviously in the breadth of organisms. Back in 1995, when the CBD was meeting in Jakarta, in COP2, there was exactly one organism, one bacteria in the world that had been sequenced. Today, we're talking about, with projects like the Earth Biogenome Project, attempting to sequence every organism on the face of the Earth. So this is a tremendous transformation that's occurred during the lifetime of the CBD. The process on digital sequence information emerged from the ATEG on synthetic biology that took place in 2015. I'm not going to run through the whole cycle that you can see in the slide, but I just want to point out a couple of important things about it. Back in Sharm el-Sheikh and at COP14, an important event happened. And that was many developing countries, and Africa in particular, linked resolution of fair and equitable benefit sharing for digital sequence information to adoption of the global agenda. And this link continues, and this is why the digital sequence information agenda item is on the open-ended working group. Discussion on DSI has also been made more difficult and has been delayed by the pandemic, like a lot of things. Over the last couple of years, the only substantive discussions that have been had are informal. And that's through the DSI dialogue group, which has taken on perhaps a bit more profile than it would have under normal circumstances. But the overriding point here is that, one, there's a large group of countries that have strongly linked developing a fair and equitable solution to DSI to adoption of the agenda. And two, that this is not really a new issue now. It's been around since 2015, and there has been scant serious formal discussion of it. And it's something that we really, and part of that is the result of a pandemic, but not all of that. And the pressure is really mounting because the technology is moving faster and faster to come up with a solution. And now my final slide is just to talk about a few key points in the negotiation. So what's happening now is that enormous troves of the sequence information of organisms across the planet are being put together. In fact, they're being put together faster than anyone knows how to use them. This is another thing that's a parallel a bit to data science and other areas. We're creating a lot of data of a lot of things right now faster than we're able to interpret it. But a key aspect of what's happening with the acquisition and use of DSI is that there are intrinsic elements to the way DSI is used that are not particularly amenable to a bilateral approach to access and benefit sharing. But it's important to say that doesn't mean that it's impossible. Track and trace is possible. There are ways to do access and benefit sharing for digital sequence information on a bilateral basis. But the the ways in which DSI are used make that difficult. So the ideal world that I think many people that are working in this would like to see is that of a multilateral comprehensive solution that can deal with both the aggregate value of DSI, meaning the insights that come from analyzing tens or hundreds of thousands of sequences, and the individual value of DSI, because there are still individual genes and forms of genes that can be incredibly valuable. Another point here is that the significance of this phenomenon has to be, the economic significance of this phenomenon has to be fully recognized. The value of DSI is no longer in doubt. And if you do still doubt it, all you have to do is look at COVID vaccines. Essentially, all COVID vaccines are reliant on DSI, some to a greater degree than others. Many of the licensed COVID vaccines are very highly reliant on DSI, would not exist without it. And all future COVID vaccines will be reliant on a global effort to collect organisms, to sequence them, and to make that information available. Well, just for this one organism, then, you're talking about a DSI-derived value of tens of billions of dollars a year. So what we're talking about here is not a small benefit sharing program to make databases and sequencers available to people in developing countries. There's a major economic value associated with DSI, and that value is escaping traditional approaches to access and benefit sharing that are based upon a physical transfer of materials and national access laws. Two final points with respect to what I think is very important in the upcoming DSI negotiation. One is that the open access paradigm, open access databases in biology simply cannot continue to do business the way that they're doing now. We may be able to keep something that we call open access, but it is impossible for open access to continue to be a situation wherein everything is uploaded to a database that anyone, particularly corporations, have access to, and they are free to use that information however they want to. This situation cannot continue to exist. And that causes friction in the corporate and in academic and in various areas, because they become accustomed to this free access to DSI, but access to DSI and open access databases must be made subject to terms and conditions that require benefit sharing in the event of commercial use. And this is going to be one of the key points of the negotiation. Finally, if we are successful in developing a multilateral benefit sharing system, what should it support? And here I would submit that, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a question of facilitating access to technology to developing countries so much, though that may be part of it. But I think that there is a perception among some in the North that the benefit sharing system for DSI is going to be to replicate the DSI analytics and systems in developing countries. Well, perhaps that's part, but the real one, I think, is to support IPLCs in their development and maintenance of their own knowledge systems. Because we know, as one of the few bright spots as you look around in biodiversity conservation around the world, is that territories that are under the control of IPLCs tend to be surviving in a more intact state than others. And rather than looking upon traditional knowledge as something to extract and to insert into our own sort of extractive information system, we should look to be supporting the continued maintenance and development of traditional knowledge systems. And that should be really where the benefit sharing should be directed, that comes out of what we would hope to be a multilateral benefit sharing system with significant benefit sharing that is really linked to the scale of the commercial profits that are being made from DSI.
Thank you so much, Kadir. And I'm very sorry for the issues with my presentation and screen sharing. But well, I'm happy to share some insights from the Global Youth Biodiversity Network on the first draft. I will, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it well.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, we are the youth constituency to the CBD, and also we are a youth-led global network for mobilization, empowerment, and action towards a life in harmony with nature. We work with regional and national chapters, and we also have membership from organizations and individuals. We developed our own vision for biodiversity, which is based in the integrity of our life support system, a society living sustainably, and on equity for nature and for people. We also have developed some advocacy priorities that are based in the results of national and regional consultations that we developed around the world with young people. These advocacy priorities are intergenerational equity and full and effective participation of youths, transformative education, and rights-based approaches for people and nature. I will explain a bit of the first two. Intergenerational equity is a part of equity in general, but it's more focused on the right of all generations that have to hold the environment in common with other species, sharing the responsibility in ensuring a fair and sustainable planet for all the generations that follow. We are tackling a full and effective participation of younger generations in this priority as well. Transformative education is a topic that came out very strongly from all our consultations because it is key for young people. It's a leverage point for transformative change as recognized by IPES. And it refers to diverse approaches and strategies for education to basically reconnect or reestablish our relationship with nature. I want to explain right-based approaches because we had a wonderful presentation by Helen already, and everybody knows already what we refer to with rights-based approaches. I just want to say that this is also a key priority for us. And now I will share some insights on the first draft. If I'm going too fast, please let me know for the interpretation. So I'm going to share these first insights based on our three priorities that I mentioned. Of course, on our participation in the OAWG3, we're going to do interventions on more issues, but given the short time frame, I'm going to share only the ones that are based in these priorities. So regarding intergenerational equity and full and effective youth participation, we first suggest that on the purpose paragraph, which is paragraph 2, we add children and youth and women and girls to the set of actors that are mentioned there. On the mission paragraph, which is 10, we ask to respect planetary boundaries. It has a lot of relationship with intergenerational equity because when we talk about planetary boundaries, we talk about the future and how we enable future generations to allow the same conditions that we are enjoying right now. And finally, on the goal, nature's contribution to people, we ask to include also future generations. Same on target 11, include future generations. On target 21, and this also has to do with rights-based approaches, we have to include a little bit of the language of the Escazú Agreement, which we consider very important. So we have to include access to justice and information, to add children to youth, that's another addition, and to ensure the safety of environmental human rights defenders, because we believe these are also not considered here and it's super important. On enabling conditions, we have to recognize the principle of intergenerational equity. That was already an enabling condition on the 0.5 draft. And we saw that it's gone on the first draft, so we would like to have it back. On transformative education, we're proposing a new target. We know it's a bit ambitious, but we will still like to push for this target because it was open in the working group too. We are proposing to ensure that transformative education on biodiversity and cultural diversity is integrated into formal, non-formal, and informal education programs, promoting values and behaviors that are consistent with living in harmony with nature. An alternative option is that on target 20, we have transformative education strengthened. The word transformative as an addition, and we have the definition of transformative education afterwards in the text. Another addition that we ask is for effective governance and management of biodiversity, because we think governance mechanisms are important. We propose a definition of transformative education that is based on a previous CBD document, which is the one that you can read there. I'm not going to read it because I explained it before. And also we would like on target 12 to include references to learning, because it's also important to recognize learning among the benefits. And finally, on rights-based approaches, I already mentioned the changes that we would like to see in target 21, referring to the Escazú agreement especially. Also on goal C, we would like to see the derivatives of the utilization of genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge specified in the text, because that is very important for us. Also, based on the discussion that we heard before on DSI. And on target 6, on target 3, we would like to see an inclusion of not only equitably managed, but equitably government systems of protected areas, because this is referring to the IPLC lands as well, and also the recognition of the free, prior, and informed consent of IPLCs, including the appropriate recognition for and support for the collective lands, indigenous, and resources of indigenous peoples and local communities. That is also something important for us, because we feel also linked to the indigenous perspectives. Finally, on target 5, have a reference to respect customary sustainable use, related to what I said before. And on target 17, also talk about the strengthening capacity to manage the control and control the potentially adverse impacts of biotechnology in human health, but also in social, economic, and cultural impacts, because these are not being addressed yet. I think that's it from my side, and I will be happy to answer to any questions, and thank you for the patience with my presentation.